This is Star Liverpool Podcasts, a podcast series dedicated to issues of identity, migration, culture, and language. I'm your host, Abby, and today we'll be exploring the legacy of Huguenot and Dutch migration to England between the 16th and 18th century. Now, if you ever had the chance to walk down or stroll down Brick Lane in London, you might have walked just like me, in complete ignorance past an inscription of horses on top of a quite old and quaint building. But it was not until last month or so that I came again across the same building, and for the first time the inscription. It translates from Latin, roughly in an almost prophetic tone, that we're all but dust and shadows. The building now, of course, is more recognizably known as Brick Lane Jama Masjid, or as Brick Lane Mosque, but prior to the 70s it also functioned as a synagogue, a Methodist chapel in the 19th century, and before that as a Calvinist chapel in the service of London's French Huguenot community. The Huguenots are not often on the lips of many, but along with the fleeing Protestant Dutch of the 16th century, they formed the earliest and one of the most significant population groups that sought asylum in England in the early modern period. The Huguenot and Dutch are in effect one of our earliest migrant communities. A migrant community, in fact, comprising mostly of asylum seekers from the Low Countries and France. The Low Countries being modern-day Luxembourg, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The Huguenots were fleeing from religious persecution in France, which largely occurred in two main ways. The first during the French Wars of Religion, spanning from 1562 till the Edict of Nantes in 1598, and the second during the reign of Louis XIV, or the Sun King, who reversed the edict or the points of Edict of Nantes in 1681 and began to once again single out, just as the French monarchy previously did prior to 1598, and persecute the Huguenot minority. The question may be who exactly are, or who are the Huguenots? Well, to answer that question, I think we would have to go quite a few decades back in time, maybe 100 years or so, to the Reformation period, and to the radical reformer called John Calvin. John Calvin was born in Geneva, Switzerland, and was of French descent. A lot of you might ask, well, how is Calvin in any way connected to Huguenots? And the simple answer is that Huguenots are also referred to as being French Calvinists, which should obviously answer some questions, but to elaborate on that, French Calvinists or Huguenots are the followers of John Calvin. John Calvin, of course, differs from Martin Luther in major respect. Whilst Martin Luther suggested that we should tweak the Catholic Church or particular aspects of the Catholic Church, John Calvin instead suggested a almost complete and radical reform in his work, Systematic Theology. And some of his conclusions might not be palatable to some people, but a lot of it is perhaps explained by Calvin's background in law. And the foundation, if we had to take anything back home, it kind of goes against the humanism of the Renaissance and goes against the teaching of Catholic Church. If you want to find out more with regards to Calvinism, I would like you to direct you to Tom Richley's video, which is a fantastic video, and he elaborates more on Calvinist theology and on the 5 points of Calvinism, which I don't have really time to talk about. But the crux of the matter is the Huguenots are not, in this respect, a different ethnicity. With regard to the mass of France, the difference mainly lies in their religion or their beliefs, and that's the main reason why they're being particularly persecuted. The Huguenots effectively are a group of individuals holding on to a belief system that doesn't really carry favor in France, or sorry, the French elite and or the Catholic Church. And it sort of resulted in wars of religion as a result, where Catholics were essentially at the throat of Calvinists, and Calvinists were equally at the throat of Catholics, and all hell broke out. And Calvinists were also, for instance, were also implicated in the looting of churches in Lyon and destruction of religious icons in Zurich, which is in Switzerland but not in France. But one of the distinguishing features of the Huguenots is that they wore plain clothes, as fashion was a sign of vanity. The Calvinists also became visible minorities in France, England, and Scotland. It's quite difficult to explain this, but in England there were also Calvinists, not French Calvinists, were known as Puritans. In Scotland they were known as Presbyterians, and in France as Huguenots. So the Huguenots are essentially Puritans from France arriving to England seeking asylum. Now, a lot of the Huguenots came from commercial centres in France, so cities like Paris, maybe Calais, or Riem, or maybe places like Belgium or the Low Countries such as Antwerp or Ghent. And they were, in effect, quite heavily persecuted. For example, during the period at the center of these conflicts was the Queen Catherine de' Medici, and whilst Catherine was the regent during the reigns of three of her sons, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre occurred, where 20,000 Huguenots were killed. And it only effectively stabilized when Henry IV became King of France, converted to Catholicism, yet still retained. He essentially reversed the policy of the French monarchy and tolerated the Calvinist presence in France, or the Protestants' presence in France, with the Edict of Nantes. However, they were tolerated, but they did have to respect certain conditions, live in certain cities. So it's not really full-scale toleration in that respect. So during this period we see a large influx of Huguenots into England. And of course they were welcomed into England during the reign of Elizabeth I, which was more of a reflection of the domestic circumstances of England and international politics which Elizabethan England was placed in. Elizabeth's reign began in 1558 and lasted up to, I think, 1608 or thereabout. Check now. No, it's actually 1603. But the second wave of migration, as I said before, of Huguenots occurred during the reign of Louis XIV and largely began in 1681, where Louis XIV was continuously chipping away at Edict of Nantes. He introduced legislation where Huguenots had to be billeted to support the king's troops out of their own resources, but it largely subsided after the end of his reign. And then we enter a sort of a different period with regards to Huguenots. We arrive at Huguenots in England, and that's more of a complicated picture. Largely, most of the Huguenots that came in were wig makers. Quite a lot of them were artisans, since a large proportion of them came from the commercial centres of France and the Low Countries. And in fact, we see a really interesting economic thing as well. Before the 17th or the 18th century, it was France that dominated the export of fabrics, linens, and lace making and silk work. And then, I'm not really that good with textiles, as you can tell, but it changed during the influx of Huguenots. In effect, from being an importer, Britain suddenly becomes an exporter of lace work, of wig making, of linens, and so forth. So essentially we get a large influx of Huguenots. They also introduced a lot of banking innovations to England. For instance, Bank of England was started largely by Huguenots, silversmiths, and the merchants of the city. They largely sort of settled down in areas of Soho, Chelsea in London, and pretty much were contained within the south. They didn't really venture out to the north, so there weren't major migrant communities up north. And also, sorry, I forgot to mention East Spitalfields, where we have, I think, still a functioning Huguenot church. I'm just going to quickly check that. Yeah, there is. And the Spitalfield markets and so forth. Yeah, that's how you might know it. Quite interesting. So, oh, and also in 1680s, Huguenots were also sent to Ireland, developing the linen industry in Port Arlington. So that's one exception to the rule where migrant communities settled. But the take-home message essentially is 50,000 came to England. A lot of them were merchants. And along with that, Huguenots also set up a large number of charities. A lot of halfway houses, a lot of hospitals, a lot of churches. But we largely see that during the 19th century and the late 18th century, with the advent of the French Revolution and culminating with Napoleonic Wars, we see a large hysteria and paranoia surrounding the Huguenot minority in England. So we suddenly see an increase in changing of names, surnames, anglicization of names, brewing into brown, during this period. With regard to Huguenot migration, we can also see parallels in Dutch Protestant migration. The migrations are occurring pretty much at a similar time, and it coincides with two main factors. On the one side, across the English Channel, we have England's domestic politics changing, and on the other side of the English Channel, we also have the wars of religion in Europe and the Reformation generally dictating certain parameters. So we have the, obviously persecution of Protestants in Europe, and they flee, the countries of origin, and they're accepted pretty much by Edward VI. And what we see is that Edward VI awards charters to incoming French and Dutch communities, established churches in London, Southampton, Norwich and Canterbury. But it can be argued that the welcoming attitude towards refugees or Protestant refugees didn't initiate with Edward VI, but did with Henry VIII, with his the establishment of his Act of Supremacy. But we see large influx of refugees during that period, which might have coincided with Edward's more Protestant upbringing, but it doesn't follow linear pattern of any sort, because in 1553 we have the accession of Mary I as a monarch. So and we have a lot of some awful accounts from Fox's Great Book of Martyrs to illustrate the hard times that most folk had in Britain during the reign of Mary I. And what we see in almost Kafkaesque fashion, that we see the same refugees that earlier on fled to England, fleeing back into to France and the Low Countries, predominantly due to perhaps a similarity in language, culture, sort of driving them back, in the sense of like there's persecution there, but at least if I go back, there are my compatriots that speak my language, I know the system better and so forth. But that once again changes in the reign of Elizabeth I in 1558, and again we have an influx of Dutch Protestants and Huguenots. The migrants were largely artisans and largely quite wealthy merchants coming in, or part of the elite of burger cities in the Low Countries in France. But what we see is that there has been a lapse. So in the sense of the policies were reversed under the reign of Mary I, and then again we have migrants coming in after 1558. They of course seized during the 1606 and 1609 at the sort of, I would say, during more peaceful times of the Dutch revolt, and they finish in France. The first wave finishes in terms of the Huguenots in 1598 with the Edict of Nantes. But what we need to remember is that the war did continue in the case of the Netherlands up till 1648, and the migration pretty much carried on in the case of the Dutch still into Britain. But the important thing from all of this history, and I know it was really complicated, and I might have lost some of you there and there, is that the asylum seekers that came in introduced a lot of things into Britain, introduced a lot of Dutch business practices and into Britain, a lot of the artisan and craft work that pretty much was existent but not as sophisticated as it existed in the Low Countries or northern parts of France and commercial centers of France. And it did establish a lot of industry and banking infrastructure within Britain. We also see a lot of individuals with Huguenot ancestry being responsible for a lot of stuff, even during the Victorian period. So, in the instance of Bazalgette, had built the sewer system in London, and also the great-grandson in a similar fashion, but it's not something that I think the family is particularly proud of, being responsible for the creation of Big Brother. We also have other individuals such as Eddie Izzard, who bears a Huguenot name, and we have other individuals which attest French Huguenot ancestry. So individuals that have Field as a surname, Brown, Dubois, Croquet. So it's exceptionally interesting, this entire business, where it was pretty much the result of migrant communities introducing new practices into Britain that would have otherwise not have come in. So all of this leads me back to the inscription on top of Brick Lane Mosque, which proclaims that we are all but dust and shadows. Or more correctly, we are all but dust and shadows. And the statement of impermanence of life, I think, is particularly apt, but also ironic when we begin delving deeper into the migrant history of not only asylum seeker or migrant communities, sort of history of not only this building but England and the UK on the whole. There's also quite a surprising, although a kind of a cheery side to all of this, that although our societies or societies at large appear to be largely quite negative towards, or quite awful with regards to initially accepting asylum seekers and migrant communities, how eventually flexible those communities, how those societies eventually become, particularly when we deal with England and the UK. I know a lot of people might not agree with my final statement, but I'm amazed to see nonetheless how banking, how silversmithery, how a lot of these individuals, how the charities that were established by Huguenots and Dutch Protestants have become pretty much ingrained in our in our British heritage, and have become almost indistinguishably British from the other parts of our, or from other parts or points of our heritage. And I think it's this particular aspect that often we forget or choose to ignore when we deal with migrant communities, refugees, asylum seekers, on the whole, on the individual basis, maybe on even a group basis. And I think it's quite important for us to reflect on this heritage, on this history, on this particular perspective. And I just hope the best comes out of it, and that we can explore these issues even further. Thank you for listening to my podcast. I hope this is the beginning of many, many more. This is Abby from Star Liverpool Podcasts. Thank you very much, and have a great day.